you, Caitlin, for the introduction, and I'm real pleased to be here. I want to also thank Professor Munoz and Patrick Deneen for the invitation, and Jennifer Smith for handling all the arrangements. I did finally get here and came to the conclusion that for Notre Dame and University of Virginia to be in the same athletic conference is an act contrary to nature. The Constitution of the United States of America is first and foremost a legal document. It serves as the supreme law of the land, establishing the basic structure and framework of the federal government, determining the powers of the federal government as well as some of the powers of the states, and delineating a set of basic rights. But the Constitution has played another important role, far less remarked upon, that is unrelated either to its status as law or its connection to the United States of America. The body of thought that went into developing the Constitution and then into explaining and defending it during the debate over the ratifications comprises a notable contribution to political theory. The American thinkers who were involved in this task engaged in fundamental questions of political life. They challenged a number of well-known philosophical positions, and they offered new insights. The best of their work, which is found in the Federalist Papers, merits a place alongside of such classics in political theory as Locke's Second Treatise, Rousseau's Second Discourse, and Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. One of the main topics of reflection in constitutional thought grew directly from the main practical business at hand, making a new government. The two questions that attracted attention were first, what is the best or recommended way to go about forming a government in the first place? And second, how does a government, once formed, influence or shape thereafter what might be called the public's political epistemology? That's admittedly an abstract term. I mean it to refer to the way in which a people conceives of and processes the whole political world about them. Whether, for example, people claim to be able to figure out everything themselves with their own reason, or whether they allow some space for revering and venerating things past and things noble. These two questions are quite distant from the current concerns about the Constitution, such as the proper scope of the President's power, or the degree of protection that should be afforded to businesses claiming a right of free exercise of religion. So I can therefore claim, with the usual academic pride, the irrelevance of the remarks to follow. In fact, pushing perversity further, I can, in the Constitution's own language, solemnly swear or affirm to avoid mention this morning of any of the major constitutional principles commonly referenced in public discussion, whether it be separation of powers or judicial review or federalism or checks and balances. Further still, I can pledge never to refer to the text of the Constitution itself, neither to an amendment, nor to an article or clause, nor even to a word or term. Needless to say, you will not hear a citation from any Supreme Court decision, past or present. Perhaps then it would be appropriate at this time to pause in order to allow the law professors in the audience to make a discreet exit. Well, for those who have chosen to remain, who are obviously persons of a more theoretical disposition, I should say just something at the start about the term political theory. It's been defined in a very strict sense as a quest for truth or knowledge about political things. And it's been distinguished from political thought, which is the exposition of political ideas. Political thought would include, for example, advancing arguments to support a position, like many articles today written about liberalism or conservatism. Political thought may borrow arguments from political theory, but the goal of political thought is less the search for truth and knowledge and more the aim to further a political objective. Now, it turns out by this exacting definition of political theory, most political writings, including many texts widely counted to be works of political theory, are not really works of political theory. Such, I think, might be the case for as great a work as Burke's Reflections on the Revolution, which derives from a speech that he gave that was meant to awaken people to the dangers of the French Revolution. In other words, it had a political objective. Similarly, the writings defending the Constitution, of which the Federalist is the prime example, are also, and were also aimed to achieve a political objective. Yet it's also been widely remarked, and I think justly, that the Federalist, in making its defense of the proposed Constitution, relied greatly on arguments and reasoning deriving from political theory, and that it introduced many important theoretical ideas. So for that reason, I think the two can be discussed together, political theory and the political thought of the Federalists. Now, the first question about the preferred or best way for how government should be made or formed is raised right at the outset of the Federalist, in the opening paragraph of the book. The issue is stated in a very long and complex sentence, a part of which reads, "It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." Obviously, this is not a sentence that Ernest Hemingway would have approved of. Setting aside the difficulties of the formulation, the basic issue posed seems to be clear enough. There are two possibilities. Either government can come into being by reflection and choice, that is, by some humans consciously making a plan to which people consent, or government can come into being by accident and force, that is, by chance and without consent. Now, there's no doubt which of these alternatives the Federalists hope to see confirmed. If the experiment at hand works, that is, if the Constitution is ratified and put into effect, it would support the claim, it's argued, that human beings, using their reason and intelligence, can make good government. And further, that this is the preferred way, perhaps the only way, to make good government. Notice, too, that the matter being determined here is not merely a local one, concerned with governments in the United States, but a general one that would settle, perhaps, this great theoretical question for posterity. For many years, I confess, I read this passage without ever entertaining the possibility of the superiority of the alternative position. The opinion favoring reflection seemed to me so obvious and clear as not to require any argument. And in fact, at this stage of the Federalists, no argument on its behalf is really offered. Yet far from being universally accepted, the position supported by the Federalists was already a matter of great disagreement among political thinkers. And just a few years later, in the aftermath of the French Revolution, it became a central, maybe even the central controversy within political theory. Now, I'll dispense for a moment with the dimension of whether choice is better than force, and focus on the dimension of whether reflection is to be preferred to accident in the formation of governments. Now, on the side of reflection, there are works of many political theorists who deal with the theme of constructing governments on the basis of plans derived from thought, philosophy, and science. This tradition goes all the way back to the Republic, where we see a whole city constructed in speech before our eyes. Of course, some of the efforts like this were not meant as practical plans, but exercises for instruction of some kind. Still, the idea of making government on the basis of one's reason, ideally from scratch, has captured the theoretical imagination. By the time we get to René Descartes, the first modern political philosopher, we can find him sitting in front of his warm stove in the midst of a cold German winter, dreaming of building a political system in the way that an engineer, using his reason, might design a new city, ideally starting on a level ground where nothing now exists. But there's a whole school of thought with roots in the political theory of Montesquieu and Hume that takes an opposite view and challenges the superiority of the idea of making and remaking governments. It does so not simply on the prudential grounds that if a government is to be made, the project should be executed with great care and perhaps only when absolutely necessary. These kinds of prudential arguments were fully compatible with the position of those who favored making governments by reflection, and many espoused these arguments. Now, the school I'm referring to affirmed the proposition that good government is more apt to result from growth and accretion, which is to say, in large part, from something akin to accident. Of course, most proponents of this position allowed for a modicum of human agency at the margins, where political actors could inflect the course of human affairs a little bit. But it was an error, they believed, and a dangerous error at that, to proclaim openly the superiority of the idea of wholesale making of governments, or of new modeling of governments, as the term was called at the time. Edmund Burke is perhaps the best-known proponent of this view. In speaking of his beloved Constitution of England, which of course has no written constitution, Burke observed that the English system was not, I quote, formed upon a regular plan or with any unity of design. It developed, and I continue quoting, in a great length of time and by a great variety of accidents. There's the word. Its parts, he went on, gradually and almost insensibly accommodated themselves to each other. The very idea of the fabrication of a new government, he said, is enough to fill us with disgust and horror. By this standard, a day marking the formation of government, like Constitution Day, should be an occasion for mourning, not celebration. A national law should be enacted to require that all flags be flown at half-mast as a sign of our repentance, not only for having dared to make a new government, but for having boasted about doing it. Here briefly are a couple of the arguments in favor of this strange position. Well, first, the very act of conceiving of new modeling government has something fearful about it. It seems to presuppose a central authority with plenary power to make and remake. It thereby endorses, at least conceptually, the notion of a power that is without limits or restraint, at least at the time that the government is being remade. Once acknowledged and accepted, what will prevent such a power from being invoked again? Another reason, human reason is unequal to the task of erecting a plan of this magnitude. It's too big and too complex a job. To cite David Hume, no human genius, however comprehensive, is able, by mere dint of reason and reflection, to effect a project of this magnitude. If, as some say today, you can't remake 1/6 of the economy, what makes you think that you could make 9/10 of a political system? Finally, you can think of this. The position favoring new modeling of government is destabilizing. New modeling government sets a dangerous precedent. If a government is new modeled once, why not new model it again? Just as some of a progressive temperament are inclined to tear down a house deemed old or obsolete and replace it with something spanking new and modern. This almost natural process of growth and accommodation that Burke suggests is sometimes referred to in textbooks of political theory as the organic model. This model is said to follow the almost natural process of development we sometimes see in biology, where natural is akin to what happens in the growth of, say, a stately oak tree. Along with this overall notion, in at least some versions, comes a respect or veneration for what has grown and developed, hence for customs and habits that can be said to constitute our heritage. In another version, one finds almost a worship of the principle of spontaneous order, which is nothing other than the idea of accident that is assured to work out well. Friedrich Hayek, one of our great former economists in the United States, was deeply drawn to this notion of spontaneous order. He liked to cite the Scottish philosopher Adam Ferguson, who gave the following succinct praise to accident. I quote, "Nations stumble upon establishments, which are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design." In brief, nothing like a government made from reflection. Versions of this overall notion are sometimes referred to as conservatism or traditionalism, and oddly too, but revealing sometimes as libertarianism. This organic model stands in opposition to the idea of making, which has no simple name. One would hate to call it the inorganic model. It might perhaps be identified as the synthetic or rationalist model, perhaps in its modern form the model of the modern Enlightenment. It too sometimes makes an appeal to be according to nature, but not the nature of the growing oak tree. Nature refers, in its view, mostly to necessary relationships or laws that are grasped by reasons. In short, this is not your garden variety of nature. If the organic view is to be the definitive criterion of what is conservatism, then it seems, and I'll digress a second here, that at least to the American mind, as sketched by the defenders of the Constitution, we cannot be conservative. Many English and continental conservatives who have read the statement in the Federalist that I cited about making governments have embraced this view. No respectable conservatism, they insist, can be built upon a foundation that praises the idea of new modeling government. Now, for Americans to accept this position and to allow a definition of a word by another people, especially the English, to rule us tyrannically without consent would be a horrible thing. We dare not endure this long train of abuses. Perhaps there's an American form of conservatism that is as good as that which is found in England. One fact, however, is undeniable. An important strand of our constitutional thought, by underscoring and even elevating the claim that good government is made by reflection, has shaped some portion of the American mind. There are some today who call for a redoing of the Constitution. One proponent, Professor Sandy Levinson from the University of Texas, has achieved considerable prominence by championing this cause. He never ceases to quote from Federalist 1, and he adds, for good measure, another passage from Federalist Paper 14. Is it not, Madison asked, the glory of the people of America that while they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration of antiquity? It is probably also fair to conclude that the events of passing the Constitution and setting it in motion, which the Federalist proposes as the great test of good government, had an effect on the development of subsequent history in the West. Modernity, for better or worse, has been partly shaped in favor of attempts to remake governments on the strength of the successful American example. Political thought, I know, often abstracts from reality, and some scholars have raised the possibility that there's really less theory and more rhetoric than meets the eye in this simple opposition between the organic and the synthetic approaches. It may be that many who support the idea that good government is made by reflection would not deny that good government might sometimes come about by accident. Likewise, it may be that some who argue that good government results from accident would not deny that good government sometimes can be made by choice and reflection. What is being debated here is a disagreement, probably not of theory, but in some ways of a dispute between doctrines. By a doctrine, I mean a general conclusion, perhaps drawn from theory, that is put forward publicly as a general rule, and that is offered as a political instrument or a political weapon to be made active in the world that will influence the subsequent course of events. Political theory itself is rarely rule-bound, which is to say it's rarely doctrinaire. The thinking of proponents of the organic view probably contains some logic such as this. Because so much destruction, idiocy, and fanaticism have resulted from comprehensive efforts to new model or remake government, it's best to support a doctrine, a public doctrine, that good government results from accident. Similarly, proponents of the synthetic or Enlightenment model may have in mind the calculation that because so much folly, ignorance, and superstition have been built into our traditions, it's best to support a doctrine that argues for making government by reflection. While constitutional thought in America came down initially on the side of remaking, it occupies a distinct position inside of this category. The authors of the Federalist sought to do the most possible within a framework of the argument in favor of remaking governments to take account of the concerns raised by these organic objectors. In fact, they went further. And now I'll state in a way, if there's a thesis to the talk, in a way that I hope will become clear. The Federalist seeks to qualify the synthetic or rationalist view and check it with elements of the organic or conservative view. The Federalist aims to put together or accommodate aspects of modern rationalism and traditionalism. To do so and to achieve a partial combination of these views, it must go beyond the modern expressions of them and introduce certain classical elements. This, I will contend, is the greatest theoretical contribution of American constitutional thought. In short, at this point, we have seen only part of the Federalists' overall position. Now, I turn now to the other question of how governments are made, which is the theme referred to in the 18th century as the theme of the lawgiver with a capital L, and which we usually refer to today as the theme of the founder. The process of founding involves setting in motion the idea for a fundamental change, devising a plan for a new order of society. That's the law-giving activity, strictly speaking, and then acting to put the plan into effect. Founders did all of those things. The founder, or you could be founders, perform some or all of these tasks. And the person or the persons who subsequently are credited for having done so win the sublime status and enter the platinum elite club of being called founders. Now, before saying anything about political thought on founding, it's worth reminding ourselves how often we Americans speak about founding and founders. It's a huge theme in American discourse, academic and popular. And it seems to be more prominent here than is the case in most other countries. The founders are generally viewed in America favorably, although, as anyone knows in the field of education, there's no shortage of criticisms depicting our founders as defenders of wealth and privilege, misogynists, racists, and the like. But whatever the view, Americans do talk a great deal about founding and founders. And we build monuments to them and name streets after them. There's a certain looseness in our designation about who we mean by founders. Sometimes it includes the leaders of the Revolution, whose names are often better known, such as Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. But I think the core element of founding, the reference, is to those who wrote the Constitution. Those are the ones who are deemed our founder or founders. Now, what is it that accounts for the prominence accorded in America to the founders? One answer might be that this is a simple result of the facts of history, objectively considered. It is a reflection, no more or no less, of how things actually took place. We speak of the founding and founders because we had a founding and we had founders. In other words, they built it. But there's another possibility worth considering. Americans pay so much attention to the founders because of a theoretical doctrine introduced in constitutional thought that elaborated the concept of founding, ascribed to it a positive valence, and attached to it the idea of making the U.S. Constitution. This doctrine, which begins with the idea that governments are made, which again isn't so clear, served to encourage people to look for founding and founders and to accord them an elevated status. Absent this doctrine, we would never have seen the founders in the way that we have. In fact, we might not be calling them founders. This doctrine is set forth in the Federalist, indirectly throughout the work, but specifically in Federalist number 38, which is the sequel to Federalist number 1. If a government is to be made by reflection, then there must be a maker or makers. Federalist 38, which discusses explicitly the theme of the lawgivers, is one of the fuller treatments of this topic in all of modern political thought, worthy of being studied alongside of the surprisingly few other important considerations of this theme, the most notable of which are found in Machiavelli and Rousseau. These authors, when you read their discussions of the founder, glorify the function of founding and discuss such notable figures as Moses and Romulus. Now, the Federalist likewise also surveys many of the great lawgivers of antiquity, including Lycurgus, the founder of Sparta, and Solon, a lawgiver in Athens. What is interesting about their discussion is that, in addition to emphasizing the centrality of the event of founding, it places America's founding, potentially at any rate, since the founding had yet to be completed when the Federalist Papers was written, it places the American founding into the context of these other monumental foundings in world history. More than that, it begins to suggest that our founding will surpass all the ancient foundings. Perhaps our founders will come to rival the founders of antiquity. More certainly, they say, our theoretical understanding of the way to go about founding improves on ancient theoretical understanding. Quite a bold claim. Now, I suppose it goes too far to say that there's no such thing as real history, especially if there are any historians here, and that we count as facts only what theoretical doctrines have encouraged us to see. I don't think the world is quite that malleable. At the same time, theoretical doctrines can surely influence how we see and interpret reality. If the doctrine of the Federalists may have had effect on building up founding, it's even more evident that the other rival doctrines in modernity have had the effect, at least they certainly tried, to tamp down and downplay the idea of founding and founders. Well, this is obviously the case with the organic position. Under this doctrine, because governments are not made but grow, there can't be a maker. The function of the founder thus all but disappears. And history is read or interpreted so that accident, or the process of history itself, replaces the founder. But it's not just the organic doctrine that's hostile to founding. In political theory that America's otherwise borrowed so much from, I'm referring to the thought of John Locke, the theme of founding is also downplayed. It's replaced by the idea that societies originate in a compact or contract, not in the efforts of a founder or founders. Liberal contract theory in general has little place for founding, and it has all but banished the figure of the founder from the analysis of politics. It's interesting to speculate on why American constitutional thought elects to break on this point with so much other modern thought. Since founders and founding are so conspicuous in classical political thought, found in the works of Xenophon and Plutarch, among others, the temptation might be to say that American thought, along with the thought of Machiavelli and Rousseau, is on this point more classical in its character than the rest of modernity. It's also possible to argue, and this would be a classical view as well, that American constitutional thought, since it arises from and is so enmeshed with actual politics and practice, stays closer to the phenomena of politics than does either organic theory or contract theory. It's less doctrinal, meaning less inclined to deploy ideas to change the world. But quitting such theoretical speculations, it's more important to concentrate on why constitutional thought adopted its view of founding and what effects flow from it. The Federalist account of founders, it seems, was above all meant to support and endorse the idea of political greatness and keep that idea alive inside of modern politics. The Federalist emphasizes, it certainly does not obscure or hide, the fact that political talents and virtues are unequal. The insistence on individuals of high rank in politics is something of a paradox. The Constitution abolishes formal titles of nobility and establishes popular government. Yet those who created this government recognized and underwrote the idea of a great hierarchy in the realm of political action. They stretched the idea of hierarchy. Greatness is an idea that bids us to look up to something beyond the normal. The idea of founding, therefore, keeps alive an aristocratic idea. As for the qualities that comprise greatness, it's difficult always to supply a list. The Federalist celebrates the courage, both military and intellectual, of the leaders of the revolution. But it quietly emphasizes another model, which is found in the prudent lawgiver. The lawgiver displays both sagacity and a kind of persistence and boldness, which is illustrated in the account of how the founders themselves pursued the project of the new Constitution with such commitment and pursued it to the limits of law and even perhaps a little bit beyond. The Federalists should be read as a modern mirror of princes, in which the qualities of the lawgiver become the model of virtue. It's interesting to consider how much the authors may have achieved in the realm of practice. America's lawgivers are the only persons in the world today, excepting perhaps Gandhi and Mandela, who are considered successful founders. The founders of antiquity have been largely forgotten, eclipsed by the moderns and the Americans. Among the moderns, those who have vied for high status and may have held it for a brief moment have mostly fallen by the wayside. In the former Soviet Union, the outside statues of Lenin have mostly been torn down and their mighty stone turned into dust. The planned statues of Vladimir Putin, shirt off, abs prominently displayed, have yet to be built. Mao, though still formally credited as founder of China, does not supply a model any longer for China. Even in the case of Ataturk, the modern lawgiver in Turkey, who went so far in transforming the habits of that people, we are now seeing his project challenged and perhaps dismantled. I'd like to turn now from the general idea of founders and foundings to the question of the way in which the founding took place. It's on this score, as I mentioned, that the Federalist makes one of its boldest theoretical claims by calling attention, and I quote, to the improvements made by Americans on the ancient mode of preparing and establishing regular plans of government. There are, according to the Federalists, three great differences between the American and ancient mode of establishing government. The first has to do with the number of founders. The ancients almost always had one, while the Americans note that they had a larger number, say the few, or a little bit more than the few. The few, I think, would be the principal movers behind the writing and explaining of the Constitution, people like Madison, Washington, and Hamilton. The many here would be every delegate who attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, all of them, all the mediocrities included. It seems clear to me that between these alternatives, the Federalists had in mind, though they were too delicate to say so, to openly avow so, that the founders refer to the few, or the principal founders. Now, second is the question of content, of consent. That's another difference. Most, but not all, of the ancient founders relied either on armed force or superstition, and superstition is a kind of psychological force. The American mode relied on consent. And contrary to what was said in Federalist I, we now learn that one can have reflection without consent, which was the way the ancient proceeded for the most part. That is, intelligent designs of what government should be, which were forced upon an unwilling populace. Americans proceeded by consent, but they knew it came at a price. Things might have been better in some respects without consent. In fact, this is the position of those today who believe that the Constitution should have abolished slavery. But there are advantages, too, to consent. The ratification of the Constitution was arguably the most important event in the establishment of modern democracy. In all human affairs, the initial example or beginning tends to be the most important one, setting the precedent for what comes after. Compare the American case in 1789 to the European one today, where various versions of the European Union have been submitted in referenda in a number of countries, including Denmark, France, Ireland, and the Netherlands, and where it has routinely been rejected. Never mind, they say, the elites continue to build Europe and even to pass a constitution by other means. Does this not reveal something about the spirit or manner in which governance in Europe takes place and will take place? Now, third and final difference, and I'll spend the rest of my time on this, from the ancient mode, is the written constitution. The ancients did not have a written constitution. The Americans did. The idea of a plan of government being contained in a written constitution is a point that's so widely accepted today that it's taken for granted and rarely commented on. It's almost never seen as an innovation. Oh, there are a few people who point out that one can have a constitution without having a written document. The United Kingdom has no written constitution, though it is the oldest constitutional government in the world, and some people consider it to be the most constitutional of constitutional government. Still, what's largely been lost from our discussion and thought is the idea that you could have a government without a written constitution, and some of the reasons for which that might be a good idea. That would be a subject for another day. But in looking back to the whole constitutional period, including here what happened in the states after the Revolution, we can see the development of written constitution was counted by Americans as a major innovation in political thought. Thomas Jefferson claimed that Americans, actually meant Virginians, were, I'll cite him. I can't give a speech without citing Jefferson. The Americans were the first of the nations of the earth which assembled its wise men peaceably together to form a fundamental constitution, to commit it to writing, and place it among their archives where every one should be free to appeal to its text. Strange as this sounds, I've not heard of anyone definitively controverting this claim. Proceeding by means of a written text was, of course, a necessary innovation given the prior commitment to the idea of public consent. Obviously, the public had to consent to something, and it was only by seeing that thing, that is the written text, people assembled in different places and at different times could conduct the whole exercise of consent. And the actual history of the event, if you go back and read it, proceeded in this way. In many state ratification debates, they read the Constitution line by line and debated it. But the significance of the written text went far beyond the requirements of having consent. Conceived of as supreme law, the written text now becomes the highest authority, an authority placed above government. The authority of government is now secondary. It derives from the Constitution. And no office and no official can claim to exercise any power except as it is consistent with the Constitution. The Federalist speaks of this innovation as follows. Here's another convoluted sentence. The important distinction so well understood in America between a Constitution established by the people and unalterable by the government and a law established by the government and alterable by the government seems to have been little understood and less observed in any other country. But this distinction was understood and observed here in America. The underlying principle is that will, even the will of the highest official, must be subordinate to a written law. The source of this law lies in the consent of the people, as it was conceived in the ratification process. This process proved to be an event in the realm of practice that has entered into an altered political theory. One of the great innovations of modern political theory was the idea of the social contract, which is prominent in the thought of John Locke. The idea of the contract was widely considered as the juridical source of legitimate government by theorists. But as critics of the concept frequently pointed out, it was no more than an hypothesis, something that was written about in theoretical books, but that could not be located literally in actual history. The use of popular choice in adopting the Constitution, that is of ratification, took a hypothetical theoretical idea and transformed it into a living legal institutional practice, which has played an important role in the development of modern constitutionalism. But as important as the written Constitution is, still more important is the way in which people have come to regard the document itself. Just what kind of thing is a written document? And how is it to be understood? It is on this point that American constitutional thought took one of its most significant and innovative steps. Now, from a purely legal standpoint, a written constitution is higher law. It trumps, as they say at Harvard, all other laws. But though higher law, you can ask this question. Is it merely law, or is written Constitution a text that has a different status altogether? Is it a document that can claim, in addition to being law, to be something to be regarded with reverence and veneration, that can be looked up to and deemed to have a role to play beyond serving as mere black-letter law? Is it a symbol that endows the government with a degree of respect, that is recognized as having given birth to a community, and that supplies a bond of attachment that helps bind the nation together? Americans who have no monarchy, with all the sentiments that can be associated with that institution, do have the Constitution, which perhaps performs some of the same functions. The proposition that the Constitution is something more than mere law is put forward in Federalist 49. In this paper, the author, who happens to be James Madison, creates the doctrine of attaching the sentiment of reverence to the Constitution, and through the Constitution, reverence to the whole structure of government, to the event of founding, and to the founders. This doctrine is not found in the written law. Nowhere is it set down in the Constitution that the Constitution should be venerated. It is a product of thought, an unwritten idea that was promoted by the instrument of a theoretical doctrine. Here's another instance where many today find it difficult to grasp this point, since most have already come to consider the federal Constitution, at least in a certain way, something to be looked up to, a little bit at any rate. But there's nothing intrinsic in a written text called the Constitution that says it must be regarded in this light. There's nothing logical that connects reverence or veneration to what are, after all, only words on a page. Now, evidence of this contention can be seen by consulting people's postures towards other constitutions. Even today, it's a strange kind of person who would profess reverence for, say, the Constitution of Illinois or California. These constitutions do not have this status. They don't seem to call for this status either. Furthermore, historians, I think, will confirm that there was no idea and no expectation whatsoever in 1787 that anything like a sentiment of reverence would be attached to the United States constitutions. Constitutions were simply not yet endowed with that quality. So the doctrine of attaching reverence to a written document was, in fact, hotly contested at the time. Jefferson, who never wavered in his view that the Constitution was, in effect, higher law, nevertheless strongly protested and deplored the doctrine that a Constitution should ever be endowed with the sentiment of veneration or reverence. He proposed at one point, as you probably know, that the Constitution should expire after each generation, 19 years by his calculation, and that a new one should be made at a constitutional convention. And that, though sounds strange enough, is found today in some form in 14 state constitutions. So I say Jefferson's plan may seem odd or quixotic, but it was not regarded as such at the time. Constitutions, he believed, should change and keep up with the times, like any other law. A constitution was higher law, but still ordinary law, or merely law. What are the reasons for attaching reverence to this kind of document? Well, one of them is a practical argument, a practical in the broadest and most expansive sense. Those involved in the task of writing and getting the Constitution passed came to see just how difficult a feat that was. They became sensitive, even awed, to the enormity of the challenge that they faced. And it was unlikely, they thought, they could ever easily be pulled off again. And the risk of trying to do so could destroy the community or create instability. Better to lock in again, and by endowing the Constitution with reverence, ensure its durability. Constitutional reverence ensures durability, even more than the legal difficulty imposed within the Constitution of changing it by extraordinary majorities. But there was another and even more compelling reason for calling for the Constitution to be venerated. It was the importance of introducing veneration itself into the public mind as a mode of thought. At bottom, the main issue was one of shaping the public's political epistemology. So instead of veneration being introduced merely to maintain the Constitution, we should think that the Constitution, understood in a certain way, becomes a vehicle for promoting veneration. On the one hand, there was the idea that the public epistemology should be rationalist or synthetic. Jefferson at one point wrote to John Tyler, "No experiment can be more interesting than that we are now trying, and which we trust will end in establishing the fact that man may be governed by reason and truth." That's the Federalist One view. This idea was introduced at the outset of the Federalists. That view is never repudiated in the Federalists, but it is surely modified and qualified. Even as the Federalist wants a people that is shaped in part by the idea that reason should govern, it also seeks to shape a people disposed to revere and venerate so as to check the excesses of the spirit of reason. No doubt these two ideas cannot be fully reconciled. They pull the human mind in different directions, but arguably, the best place for the public mind to be is suspended between the two. For this reason, I choose and chose, upon solemn reflection, to place Federalist 49 on my Virginia license plate. By this means, I hope to remind all on the road of the importance of fidelity to the Constitution. I wish especially to remind the willful who tailgate of the need for restraint, and those of a progressive temperament of the importance of veneration. Such is the proper spirit, I think, in which we should observe Constitution Day. Thank you.
You mentioned.
Stand up and tell us who you are.
All right, I'm Jeremy Abel. I'm a junior political science pre-med major. You mentioned the theory of John Locke, the liberal contract theory, that there didn't really have much room for a founder or framer of a government, that it was just a contract between people. But who would you say in that case is the author of that contract, if not a founder?
Yeah, well, there may be one, but it's not spoken of. It's not elevated to not elevated or spoken of examples, like Romulus, Remus, Solon. So we don't have an image of greatness built up. So probably the real founder is the political theorist himself, John Locke. That's the idea of the contract, but disavows the need to achieve a reputation for greatness. So however that works out, whoever the one is who puts it together, and there's one or two lines in Locke which someone has pointed out to me, some obscure passages and some obscure footnote. There's a prince who does this, but it's not a doctrine that's played up. What's notable about Machiavelli and Rousseau, two of the ones who is the status of the founder. It's as if they want to bring the idea of political greatness into politics, either recognizing that it exists inevitably because of the ambition of people, which might be another view, Lincoln's view as well, or because they actually want to keep that idea alive of political greatness. So they bring it in and they elevate it, and the American founders do the same thing. You're reading this book, and all of a sudden, a lengthy discussion of the idea of founding, where it's put on a kind of pedestal, and they are the ones. I mean, they didn't begin like some leaders. They didn't begin every sentence with "I," as a modern conceit, but it's pretty clear that they're referring to themselves in that essay, and they introduced this idea of political greatness, thinking that it performed a function.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. It was a very, very enjoyable talk. We really appreciate it. As I was listening, I noticed you opened by describing the Constitution as this document that formed the basic structure of our government. And throughout the speech, I took you to be suggesting that that's what our Constitution did, that is our American experience. But that, to me, the example of America is a failed attempt at the synthetic motion. When I think about American government, political parties, primary elections, the imperial presidency, the popular election of the president, the way we go to war, the sheer size of the federal government, administrative agencies, none of this bears even the faintest resemblance to anything in our Constitution. And so I wonder how you react to the idea that the American example is a the evidence that the synthetic attempt is doomed to failure, and that the veneration is just a myth for other political purposes.
Chuck went out to Burke, right? Well, I think there's a lot of what you say, but I think it's a question of proportion. We still have three branches of government, and they still check each other to a substantial degree. They fight about it where the lines aren't there, but that's still the core of American government. We've been talking about the last 4 or 5 years about dysfunctionality. What is dysfunctionality? Well, dysfunctionality is actually a doctrine of Washington political scientists who argue that the president can't get through his program. So why can't he get through? Well, it's because of Congress. The Republicans in Congress, they're functionally dysfunctional.
And would you say federalism has survived as well?
Federalism, not as much. But separation of powers remains, and it remains an utterly distinct characteristic of American government. Some of the rights remain, obviously nationalized, there are different forms, so they're there. So that part of the structure of government thing, I'd agree with you on the question of federalism. It's much more, much greater change in what we originally envisaged the Constitution to me. That doesn't mean that reading the Constitution couldn't lead a political party to try and chart a different course, so that the Constitution, even though that's not fully realized, or could become the basis of a political program in the future to decentralize things more. All that said, I'm sure those enjoying their pot
for a qualification of the reflection and choice. And how exactly is that veneration created or encouraged by the Constitution? And is that veneration, can we understand that veneration, or the founders' design for that veneration, apart from your license plate, as being dependent on actually giving the American people a good government? That is, was it simply a matter of structure, or did they think that, I mean, you can't abstract from the fact that the Constitution was a good Constitution and would secure the ends set forth, say, in the Declaration, and that the actual practice of constitutional government would vindicate the Constitution, not to mention the founders who would, at least in the early years, be running the government.
Yeah, well, I agree with Professor, what was it? Paul. Wait, yeah, it's not exactly the same thing we had. We can go through that, but I agree with the fact that the Constitution proved to be an utter failure in realizing the aims of protecting liberty, that it couldn't be venerated. There's got to be something there, and the experiment, one way or another, has to work, or at least some other experiment that people think was formed by the Constitution in view is worked in some sense, then it can be venerated. So I agree with that. I think I like the structure of the government. I think it's an admirable mechanism for modern government, but that can be disputed. But the fact is that it seems to have built a great nation on the foundation of this Constitution. And so, therefore, it can make the claim that it's worthy of being venerated. But, as I suggested, you can have a government of separation of powers written on a piece of paper that isn't venerated. That's most of our state constitutions. We really have two constitutional traditions, as Professor John Diamond in Wake Forest argues so ably. Two constitutional traditions in the United States, a federal one, or Madisonian, and a Jeffersonian one in many of the states. And they're both as logical. One is as logical as the other. And it really is a kind of eye-opening to ask the question, why have we come to venerate the federal Constitution? I think it's in part because of an argument which builds up founding and builds up veneration and tries to supply, through this doctrine, this attribute inside of public thinking, contrary to the strict Enlightenment rationalist view, which is modern, progressive, going on. And left to its device today, the people we know who want the living Constitution, which is a mild bow to veneration, very mild. We know that the people who wanted a living Constitution today were part of a progressive movement that actually wanted to rewrite the Constitution. So they don't feel that way. And you should see, as you go through the attacks made on the doctrine of veneration over the course of American history, especially in the progressive era, they liken it, veneration of the Constitution, to a cult. And cult isn't a favorable word. It's called the cult of the Constitution, which was a theme invented, actually, the theme, not because it was actually being venerated as a cult, but because the opponents wanted to make it seem as if it was venerated as a cult in order to get rid of veneration. And that was a theme adopted by many of the progressives, decrying the cult of the Constitution, to free it up altogether, decrying the cult of the founder. And this is discussed in religious terms a little bit because Jefferson made the idea about himself, said we don't want to revere the founders as people revere the sacred Ark of the Covenant, anything like that. Shouldn't have that status. And I'm not sure that it does, although, you know, you go to the archive building and you walk up a set of steps, and there is the Holy of Holies inside the Ark in a case, but that's not reverence. Hoover called it the temple. Actually, that was built in reaction. The archives building, structurally built in reaction to the attack upon the cult of the Constitution. If there's any cult that came after that argument. I've been told today, though, I can claim that I used to get private tours all the time with the archives, with a member of the National Archive Commission. I used to meet all the time, got to sneak in and see the Constitution. But I've been told it's been redesigned now. There was an article by Andrew Ferguson about a month and a half ago, or 2 months in the Weekly Standard, like all his pieces, brilliant and funny, and he shows that they re-engineered the entrance to the Great Hall. And instead of coming up to the Constitution, you go through a display which has all sorts of contemporary views about what's wrong with the founders, and then you enter on top, looking down on it. So the whole iconography has changed in an appropriate way by modern standard. But anyhow, yes.
I'm going to take the floor's privilege because I know some of our students are going to leave soon. But I'm going to plug a class I'm going to teach next semester called Liberalism and Conservatism. And one of the things that I hope to accomplish in that course is to show that these terms that we bandy about a lot have lots of different flavors. One of the things that strikes me about your talk is that you talk about the way in which a document that is in significant part shaped by, say, broadly a liberal worldview, coming out in many ways of Enlightenment tradition, beginning with an articulation of government, legitimate government being founded on reflection and choice as opposed to accident and force, inaugurates a political tradition in which to be conservative is to seek to conserve liberalism. So to introduce this language of veneration, which we might think of as a somewhat of a Burkean kind of a language, to conserve something that's in some respects fundamentally not conservative, is that existing between these two, as you suggest, or is it actually in some respects engaging in a kind of paradoxical contradiction in which the thing that you're conserving is actually ultimately going to be anti-conservative? So that the conservative tradition in America is actually a liberal tradition, which tends to promote, among other things, the thought of the Enlightenment, whereas the left tradition in America tends to be progressive, which is critical of the liberal tradition, like to put it in that term. So in other words, is there a tradition of veneration to which Americans can really ultimately appeal?
There you have what we call an antimony. These two things are uneasily put together, and certainly the Constitution seems to be, as you said, a product of Enlightenment thought. But the way I tried to put together a little bit is that independent of actually what the government is and what it's founded upon, is a public epistemology of how people think. And I think it would be possible, and I think it is possible, to have a more, let's use the word conservative or traditional epistemology. That would be compatible with a liberal political structure and a little liberal notion of how governments were originally founded, established. I think those two can be put together, in attention to be sure, but put together. And that's why I also brought up this idea of greatness. What place is there for greatness inside of contract theory or like that? This is another idea. So I guess I agree with the analysis that, in a way, you have this paradox of views. How can you have a traditional outlook or a traditional disposition inside of a liberal constitution, but maybe you could have a space for a traditional, let's say, psychology inside. It's probably not a good answer, and you probably put your finger on a real difficulty, as Patrick always does. So
I'm not happy about it, but there it is. I saw it. Yes, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'm Mark Oppenheimer. I'm a graduate student in political theory. I also wanted to ask about the idea about veneration. You said that veneration was an idea introduced by the founders, as though it was itself part of the reason and choice. But it seems to me like veneration is the other thing. Veneration is more of an accident. It comes about over time. I think it's maybe what Winner was hinting. And so they were maybe using this understanding that what's going to arise from their reason and choice is this veneration. But we, as those who venerate and don't often change our constitution, are no longer, it seems, governed by, in as much as we're sort of venerated, we're no longer governing ourselves by reason and choice, but for us it's accident and force. It's an accident that I was born as American, and there's a government enforcing the laws upon me. I mean, I guess if 3/4 of us got together, we could, actually have a reason and choice, but effectively, we don't. So, what it seems like, in as much as that this prerogative of making a government or having a government be a product of our reason and choice was only reserved to these people who we now consider great, venerate. So it seems kind of unfair, but that greatness and reflection and choice were for them, for us it's mere veneration, we're back to accident, of course. And so it seems to remove the legitimacy. If that's the way you do government, the government is very legitimate if I have no reflection choice.
Well, that's the first point you make is a good one. This doctrine of veneration is adopted by reason and reflection. It is not necessarily followed, as you point out, by consent. Say it has an element about it, you could say, I won't use the word superstition because there is such a thing as rational veneration, but for many, the veneration is not rational. It's simply accepted as habit. Right. And that's what you see. You see the same thing in Lincoln's Lyceum address. He says, reason, cold calculating reason will tell us to make a civil religion. Well, that's fine for the one who's creating it. They're using their reason to do it. But those who are actually following the civil religion, most of them are not doing it through ordinary reason. They're not choosing their part of the religion. That's the purpose of doing it. And he sets it down in the same terms as the code of in Deuteronomy of how you should respect the law. So what you have then is something chosen on the basis of reason, in which it is accepted not entirely on the basis of reason. I say not entirely because those of you who study the American founding can reason your way through to the same conclusion and see why. But the doctrine of veneration, most of those who venerate will not be engaged wholly in reason. So, so there's an element you could say of force might be too strong. But that's part of the intimity of the contradiction or the difficulty. But think of a better way. You can't get around that problem any other way. And it's the same problem, as I said, which Lincoln addressed and which the American Whig Party addressed. They said, in a way, it's important to have this veneration. So that's what I meant by saying it's a real qualification of the Enlightenment view. It's not the Enlightenment view that Jefferson says that will always be governed by truth. That was why he wanted the Constitution to be written every 19 years, not just because you'd get a better one, but because you would be forced to go through the exercise of reasoning things through. And the reason he so much deplored Madison's doctrine was not because of what was in the Constitution so much as the fact that it would get people in the habit of venerating. And once they start venerating, what comes next? Well, they venerate the government, then you get kings, which are based upon veneration, then you get churches, and it's a slippery slope. And this isn't my reasoning that I'm introducing here. If you read, as I mentioned, all these arguments in the progressive era, just this language and just this argument was made about the danger of veneration. That veneration was the tool or instrument in the view of the Enlightenment. The tool or instrument of keeping the many down through ignorance and superstition, or prejudice, if you want to use the word, from which people had to be free. This was the great experiment. And what I suggest, and others have, of course, noticed this about Madison's paper, is that it's a real qualification on this. It calls it into question. And I'd like to appreciate your comment very much. I want to add that we have to still have to do a written version of this and point out the point that this is a rational doctrine that's chosen, but doesn't support fully reason. Going back one to final point, as I mentioned, they realized, the founders, that reason doesn't always, consent doesn't always produce the best result. That's obvious. The classical founders, some of them proceeded without consent, and they had some pretty good plans. And as you know from reading The Republic, which is a fiction, there's no consent. How do you get consent? You take kids when they're 5 years old, you lead them out of the city. That's a good way to get them to consent, and then start pounding this stuff into them. The only one, incidentally, I'm getting a little off the subject, it's my prerogative. The only one, incidentally, I know to have seriously proposed Plato's idea for how to found a society, in reality, was Thomas Jefferson. That was his plan for eliminating slavery in the United States, that all the slave children would be removed from their family and brought up in camps at the age of 5 or 6 years old to cut the connection between the generations. Trained as best one could in these camps to be free people, and then shipped to probably Mississippi or Alabama to start another country. That was his plan. Pretty extreme plan, but pretty extreme problem. Think about that one.
Mark Rockline in America's grad student, so
okay, have at it, Mark.
Forgive the operational question. I was wondering if you would speak maybe to this gap between veneration and action, because it seems that the Constitution, or at least we take an enormous amount of action and continuously protect it, and then improve on it, making amendments. I was wondering if there was a direct link between veneration and action, motivated by that veneration.
Well, you know, as you said, veneration suggests the idea of not changing very much. And the federal constitution is structured in a way that it's not very flexible. We haven't had very many amendments. You know, subtract the first 10, since they're part of the founding. We had, I don't know, 16 or 17. A few of them contradict each other. It's been changed on the text very, very, very rarely, with only a couple of really significant ones. You know, maybe the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, a few others. It's as distinct from the state constitutions, which are amended all the time. I mean, look at California. You don't even know the difference between an amendment to a constitution and a statute. They've lost all significance. That's happening all across the country in many places where people have written things into the Constitution, supposedly to try and give them more sanctified status. But as we know, these can be swept aside by the federal courts, as in the case now with marriage and whatnot. But that was the idea behind it, put them in the Constitution. But there's no difference in people's mind between the Constitution and statutes in these states. So I don't think we changed it very much, the Constitution. And I think that was by design, and veneration was a way of doing it. We haven't changed it formally. You can get into theories of Bruce Ackerman and everything that said we change it every day, or judicial review is nothing but a daily constitutional convention in which people derive from such obscure words as capitation. I still don't know what that means. Justice Roberts somehow concluded from that something about the Obamacare Act. All these legalisms that none of us even could pretend to understand and don't care about. And that's what government does. But the Constitution itself, in the realm of action, was meant to be rare, changes that would be rare. And I think that's what we've seen.
One more question. Yes.
I'm Matthew Hartman, a second year grad student. You're talking a lot about these rules of founders, these remarkably important people, particularly like Machiavellian founders like Moses or Romulus.
They were pretty important too.
Yeah, and I think Machiavelli also discusses these ideas of refounders. So, you know, Rome doesn't just work because you have Romulus, it also works because you have Numa. Yeah. And I mean, taking this into an American context, I mean, you know, you have a constitution, even the best constitution, I mean, you know, Lincoln writes that, well, you're not going to revere it forever, and so you have to have figures of refounders kind of come in and, you know, revitalize the actual constitutional project. I mean, that's what Jefferson has in mind, I think, when he says, you know, 19 years, you have a new constitution. But, you know, what kind of figures would you actually consider as refounder type figures that don't necessarily have to, you know, rewrite the entire constitution, but, you know, put some sort of new idea of reverence into it?
Right. Well, you know, there's three basic categories of greatness of the others, but, you know, there's ones who establish something without being lawgivers. There could be the poetic founder who brings something out. Then there's the lawgiver, the one who puts shape to government. And then you could say there's the savior of a people, which could involve, that would be Churchill, he didn't found the government or anything. And Lincoln is somewhere between a savior and a refounder. So that's why his status is so high. But as he pointed out, a full effort to become, you know, great at the height would require something at that level. A savior who actually reorients the direction of government. And so he points out that that's the only way to achieve full greatness, because if you work under someone, they're bigger than you are. So he said, you want to be in that tribe of the eagle. Are you thinking of that?
Yes.
Yeah. And want to have that great ambition to be in that tribe, then you can only do it by destroying or undermining or overcoming what exists. Otherwise, you're playing within that framework. And I think, you know, Lincoln is the case, a paradoxical case. Is this a perpetrator, someone who maintains the Union and, in a way, but is it someone also who rebounds in a way? And that's why he's considered, I think, as great as the original founders, or almost the founder in his own life. And you mentioned the others, that's the case too. I had to go back and consult all my dictionaries of ancient times to see where Numa and the others, and Publius, where they stood as refounders. But you know, I think you got to be, if you want to really be at the top, you've got to be in the place where you're making a significant reworking and rechanging.
Join me.
Thank you.
over there. Students who are interested in
No.
constitutional studies minor and also
Savior.